Okay, we're gonna try this again here. I've tried this a couple times now and still trying to figure out how it all works. But we're gonna be talking about ecology, and our first section of ecology will be energy flow and ecosystems. So we're gonna be following how energy goes from one organism to the next as we move along in an ecosystem. The standards we'll be covering will be the 17.9, where we will be able to use a food web to identify and distinguish producers, consumers, and decomposers, explain the pathway of energy transfer through trophic levels and the reduction of available energy at successful trophic levels. And pre-IB, this is going to be the same with you with honors here. Um, You'll have to be able to differentiate among the various forms of energy and recognize that they can be transformed from one form to another form of energy. So here we go. Ecology. What is a ecology exactly? Ecology is the scientific study of interactions among organisms and between organisms and their physical environment. So if we just quickly remember some basics about word formation, we have eco, and eco is going to refer to ecosystems. So we have a general idea of what ecosystems are. You know, it's where we have different organisms interacting with one another, living in these environments. We'll see a little more in detail what ecosystem is later. But then we also have this ology part, and ology means study of. So we have the scientific study of interactions among organisms and between organisms and their physical environments. These interactions are based on energy and nutrients, so that's what we are doing even as people, but whether it be grass, whether it be a squirrel, whether it be a lion, um, our interactions are all based on energy and nutrients, trying to get energy and nutrients from whatever source possible. The physical environment and organisms are considered to be interdependent, and this interdependence means that there is dependence between or among individuals or things. So that means that we depend on physical components of our environment, um, and that there is some dependence on the physical component. It also depends on us in some way, shape, or form. So what does that look like? Well, a fish, if we want to look at a fish, might actually be dependent on hills. Now, that doesn't make much sense. Hills are land, and fish live in the water. So how can a fish be dependent on a hill? Well, let's look at this. Let's say we have a hill here. All right, so we have two hills, and our hills form this perfect little bowl for water. So fish live in the water. So we have a little fish here. We'll have a little fish here. It's difficult to draw on a computer, so don't worry about that. That's a fish. This is water. And these are two hills. So these fish are dependent on these hills because without these hills, we wouldn't have this little bowl for water to collect in. We wouldn't have this area for a lake or a pond to form. So, in sort of a roundabout way, these fish are dependent on the hills, and the hills are going to be dependent on these fish being in this area because these fish are going to bring all sorts of other organisms that are going to feed on the fish, and things are going to feed on the things that eat on the fish to maintain these hills. So, in a very physical way, these hills would have no purpose or they would serve very little function without these fish being here. So how do we study ecology? Three primary ways: observation, experimentation, and modeling. We can physically observe how ecologists or how ecology works, we can look at how an animal and a plant interact, or how two animals interact with one another, or how they interact with the physical environment. We can form experiments to determine how these interactions are working, what their purpose is, what they're doing. And we can also model. So by modeling, we can take large ecosystems and make a smaller version of it, so it's a little more obtainable, a little more functional, um, as far as for studying purposes, and see how different organisms are interacting with one another. To be able to study this, we can't just say, all right, I'm going to go study ecology and study the entire world. That's not going to be a very efficient means of studying, so we have to be able to break things down into a little bit smaller units. So from top to bottom here, we go from the simplest to the most, well, from the smallest really to the largest. So at the top, we have individual organisms, and at the bottom, we go all the way down to Earth. So we have simple or individual organisms. If I want to pull out a single bear, then I could study a single individual bear. I could study a species of bears. So I could study all brown bears, or all grizzly bears. That would be a species. I could study a population. So a population is going to be um, within a defined area. All the animals of the same species will be in a population in a single defined area. I could be looking at a community. A community is going to be more than one species within still a defined area. So I could be looking at bears, I could be looking at the squirrels, I could be looking at the salmon, all these different species, all living in the same area that are going to create a community. I could look at an ecosystem. So we move from just looking at the animals that interact together to also the physical environment that they're in is going to create the ecosystem. I could look at a biome, and I'll hold off on explaining that in a second. Uh, and after a biome, we have Earth. And yes, this is biome, not bio-me. It's biome. Again, it's a little bit different representation. We have individuals, we have a population. This kind of skips species. We have a community where now we have multiple different species all living together. We have an ecosystem where we now include this rock, which is a physical component of this environment. So we have the community plus the physical. We have a biome. A biome is going to be an ecosystem, um, but it's a collection of similar ecosystems. So these two are separated. There are two ecosystems separated here by this rock. We have an ecosystem over here to the left and an ecosystem over here to the right. They are very similar ecosystems. So this is one biome. It's all the same kind of type of ecosystem, but there's just more than one in existence here. Then we have a biosphere, where we put together all the different biomes we have in the world to create one biosphere, and biosphere is the same as the Earth. Our Earth is a biosphere. So we're going to take this individually a little bit here, looking at each of one of these in slightly more detail. This is pretty self-explanatory. An individual organism is going to be a single form of life. If we have lions, an individual organism is just one lion. Species, we have multiple lions. For an organism to be of the same species, these species have to be able to breed to produce a fertile offspring. So what does that mean? It means that this offspring, so if we're looking at this little cub, this cub is going to grow up to be able to have offspring of its own. That means it is fertile. Most of the time, well, always, if we have a lion going to cross with, I don't know, an antelope, then if we manage to even get a viable offspring from that, that lion antelope cross is not going to be fertile because it's a cross of species. A lion and an antelope are not of the same species. So if they cross, they're not going to have a fertile offspring. They would have an infertile offspring. So that offspring would not be able to have babies of its own. A population is going to be a group of individuals that belong to the same species and share the same habitat. They're going to be within a defined space instead of looking at the entirety of Africa as a population of lions. We would have a section of all of Africa, so it'd be a defined habitat. So if we were looking at this box, we would have a species of, or a population rather, of lions that all live in this region or within this perimeter. Now, there wouldn't actually be a line in the sand anywhere. This is going to be an invisible perimeter, but there are perimeters nonetheless that we'll talk further in detail about later on that make a population. Communities, we have a mixture of different species all living together. So we could have lions, we could have antelopes, we could have certain varieties of grass, grasshoppers, all kinds of different species all living together in the same area. This doesn't necessarily mean that they're all happy and friends. One might be trying to eat the other within a community, but they are a community nonetheless. Ecosystems, again, we go from community to now adding in the physical environment. So we're going to have the water, we're going to have the hills, we're going to have the desert, if there's a desert, the sun, all these things now interacting with one another to make an ecosystem. Ecosystems, when we have multiple that are very similar, we get a biome. So it's a group of ecosystems that share similar climates and typical organisms. So if we look at the latitudes of our Earth here, latitude being the ones that go long ways like this, we can see that we have similar biomes across latitudes. If we look at the very top in the purple, we have tundras, and they're generally along the same latitude. They're going to share the same type of temperature. They're going to share the same type of general organisms that are going to be able to live there. The same plants, the same animals. They're all going to live there. So if we move down to kind of what we're most familiar with, this kind of hunter green color, these are mixed and deciduous forests. We're going to be able to find those where we live. We're going to be able to find those over in China. We're going to be able to find those in the United Kingdom, France, all sorts of places. We're going to share similar temperatures. We're going to be able to find similar types of animals. That doesn't mean that if I pick up a squirrel from my backyard and take it over to France with me, that squirrel is going to be able to live and survive. But what that means is that there's going to be an animal that's kind of similar to a squirrel, or a different type of squirrel that has a lot of similar features to our squirrels living in those two places. And then finally, we have our Earth, or a biosphere, where all of these biomes are put together. So think about it. Does the environment affect you? Also, do you have an effect on your environment? It certainly does. So what kind of clothes did you wear to school today? Are you wearing short sleeves and shorts? If you are, then that's probably because our environment has decided, well, our environment didn't decide, but our environment is warm today. So in turn, you decided that you would wear clothes that would help keep you cool. If we rewound back to February, where we had a lot more cold days than we do now, our environment was much colder, so it affected you by influencing you to wear clothes are going to help keep you warm. Now we could talk about energy and how that affects your body as well, but our temperature outside is also just generally going to affect the amount of energy that you consume just sitting in a chair to help keep you warm, to help keep you cool. Um, these sorts of things are going to affect you. Now, can you affect your environment? Well, absolutely. You can very physically go and move things around. If you don't like a big rock in your backyard, you could go remove that rock, and you're going to affect the environment of your backyard, and the things that might wanted to live on or around that rock are now going to be displaced. You've affected it that way. Or we could talk about um, you know, burning fossil fuels and how we're affecting our environment in that way. Environmental conditions include two general things, which we're just going to put words to. You knew this was the case already anyways, but we call these biotic and abiotic factors. So these two things directly affect one another. Biotic factors are any living part of an environment with which an organism might interact. They're biological influences. So a biotic factor might be um, the grass growing outside. This is a part of an environment that you're going to interact with it. You're going to walk across it. It's something your dog's going to interact with. Your dog's going to walk across it. It's going to use the restroom in it. It's going to sniff all sorts of stuff that has crossed it previously. The ants that are going to try and build a nest are going to interact with that grass. The lizards, the worms, all sorts of things are going to interact with that grass. And we could do the same sort of thing with any other living organism, an environment you want to talk about, whether it be a tree, whether it be a hawk. Abiotic are going to be the non-living parts. So if we go back to that rock is an abiotic factor or an abiotic component, a physical component of an environment. It's not alive, but it still can influence and interact with the environment, with other things around it. So looking at this again, here we have an entire ecosystem. At the top we have animals, we have plants, trees, we have water, we have mountains, we have a sun, we have a mix of living and non-living things together. The abiotic factors are going to be the dirt that the grass grows on top of. It's going to be the water, it's going to be the mountains, and it's going to be the sun. These are not living things, but they are physical components of an environment. The biotic factors down here are going to be the grass that grows, it's going to be the trees that grow, it's going to be the animals that live in the ecosystem. We're going to have these different types or different categories of animals that we'll talk about in a moment that are going to be the biotic factors. We put these biotic and abiotic factors together, we get an ecosystem. Remember that living things interact with living and non-living things and vice versa. Non-living things interact with living things. I can't iterate this enough. That's an important component to an ecosystem. Living and non-living things have to interact with one another. So when living things interact with one another, this is generally what we call symbiosis. Now, when you've heard symbiosis before, you've probably thought that it means that they're living happily together. That's not always the case. Symbiosis very generally can mean just an interaction between two organisms living in close proximity. They live close together. So there's three sub sections, I guess, of symbiosis. The first one being mutualism. Mutualism is when they do benefit one another. So for example, this bee and this sunflower have a mutualism, or in mutualism, they have a mutualistic relationship. They benefit one another. The bee comes and pollinates the flower, while the flower gives the bee a sweet treat in return for doing that job for it. So they both get something out of this relationship. If we're looking at this whale, and we have things like other fish, barnacles that will attach to whales, this is called communalism, and this is where one benefits. So the barnacles are going to benefit, and I'll explain why in a second, while the whale doesn't really get anything out of it. It's just kind of meh about the presence of the barnacles on it. It's not really hurting it, not helping it, they're just there. So the barnacles get to benefit from this relationship by getting to travel around where they can filter feed on the different water. There's a water flow that benefit the barnacles in their ability to feed. Parasitism is where one benefits and one is harmed. So a flea on your dog is a parasite. The flea is very happy because the flea gets to eat, but it is detrimental to the health of your dog. So we have a parasitistic relationship here where one is happy, one is actually hurt from this relationship. So why do organisms eat? To obtain energy. Why do you eat? You get hungry, but you're hungry because you need more energy. So at the core of every organism's interaction with the environment is its need for energy to power life's processes. Without energy, there are no life functions. So things that make you go, where does energy in living systems come from? Think about that for a minute. Where do they come from? Or where does it come from? Secondly, how is energy transferred from one organism to another? This one might be a little more obvious. So we're going to our lesson guiding question, our first one, that is, what influence do decomposers, producers, and consumers have on an ecosystem? We have producers, consumers, and decomposers. These are our three categories or three types of organisms that exist. All organisms in an ecosystem need energy to live, and these organisms can be grouped by how they get energy. So that's how we have grouped, that's what these groups are. This is what producers, consumers, and decomposers are. They are the groups that vary on how energy is obtained. So every organism in an ecosystem has to be one of these three. So producers, what are producers? Producers are the organisms that primarily get their energy from the sun. That's supposed to be yellow. So producers are pretty much our plants. So we have our grasses, our trees, our vegetables, our fruits. So we have grapes, we have sunflowers, we have different types of trees, even cacti. This also includes things like seagrass, kelp. These are plants that live underwater, but they still use the sun to produce their energy. So they are producers, they're making the energy. So most animals are consumers. So crabs, turtles, chickens, squirrels, you and I, we are all consumers. We consume the producers. So the producers get their energy from the sun, consumers get their energy from producers, and so bet you can guess where decomposers get their energy from. They get it from consumers. So this will either be from the wastes that consumers leave, or they might be from the consumers' bodies themselves. So when we have a fish that dies, or we have a chicken or a squirrel that dies out in nature, then decomposers, things like mushrooms, different bacteria sometimes are decomposers, lots of different examples, are going to be the ones that break down, decompose the consumers into the energy that these guys will use. And the cycle will continue, and we'll see that in a few minutes. Sunlight is our ultimate energy source, so it all starts with our guy, the sun. So what happens to energy stored in the body tissues when one organism eats another? Well, as you might guess, the energy moves from the eaten to the eater. So um, let's go back here. If we go from these grapes, the energy stored in these grapes goes from the grapes to the person that eats those grapes. The energy, it's transferred from one to another. Energy in an ecosystem only travels in one way. So we're not going to go from um, once the energy from these grapes go to the person, that energy is not going to go back from the person to the grapes. That can't happen. It's going to be linear. It's only going to go in one direction. No pun intended for that band. So to see how this energy flows, we have two tools. And those tools are going to be food chains and food webs. So this is a food chain. It's pretty simple. We start with our sun, and the sun gives energy to a producer. So then we break down our consumers into various types of consumers. So we have energy from the sun going to the producer, and then from the producer, from the producer to the primary consumer. This primary consumer is going to be something like a cricket. It's going to be something that's an herbivore, meaning it only eats plants. It only eats producers. So energy will flow from the sun to the producer to the primary consumer. After the primary consumer, we're going to have a secondary consumer. So this secondary consumer is going to be the one that eats the primary consumer. So we go from an herbivore to an omnivore, meaning that this secondary consumer might eat either the herbivore, the primary consumer, or sometimes it might cut out the middleman and eat the producer itself. So that's what an omnivore is. It might eat plants or it might eat other producer-consuming organisms. Then we have tertiary consumers, and these guys are carnivores only. They will never eat a producer. They'll only eat other consumers. So they could be most likely a secondary consumer in this realm where the snake is going to eat a mouse or a rat. Then we have another tertiary consumer, which is still a carnivore. And so in this case, we're going to have a hawk that's going to eat the snake. Then at some point, the hawk is going to have some waste, and the hawk itself is at some point it's going to die. It's going to be decomposed. So these decomposers are going to use the energy from the carnivore, from the tertiary consumer, to live and grow. These decomposers are going to have some waste themselves, and these nutrients are going to then be recycled back to help the producer live. So this is our food chain. Energy starting at the sun, going to the producer, going to the primary consumer, secondary consumer, however many other tertiary consumers we might have, and then they'll be decomposed, and the nutrients will be cycled back over to the producer. Food chains in actuality are a little too simple. So we have food webs that are a little more realistic. So it's food web, pretty fitting name here. We have, a big crazy network of things going on here. But what food webs do is they show us the different possibilities of what might eat what. So instead of being super linear like this food chain is, this is saying that this rat will only eat this primary consumer, or this snake will only eat this rat. That's not necessarily the case. They might eat something else some of the time as well. So here, if we start with these berries, so what this doesn't include is a sun. So if we had a sun, the sun would send its energy to the berries, or the berries will get its energy from the sun. And then we'd have a number of things that might eat the berries. We have a green fly that might eat the berries. We have butterflies that might get energy from the flowers of the berries. We have a grasshopper that might eat the leaves of the berry plant. And then we might even have a titmouse. This is a bird that might eat the berries themselves. So there's a number of things that might eat these, and so we have a couple of different food chains, if we follow this in a linear direction, put together to make this food web. So let's follow this with the green fly. So we have energy from the sun to the berries, from the berries to the green fly, from the green fly to a ladybug, not ladybird, a ladybug. So the ladybug might eat this green fly, a dragonfly might eat this ladybird, or a titmouse might eat the ladybug. Um, and then we could keep going. We could have a fox that might eat the bird, or we could have a frog that might eat the dragonfly. A snake might eat the frog. A buzzard might eat the snake. There's all sorts of different directions we could go with this. We could start over at this plant, and we have this rabbit might eat part of this plant, and then this fox might eat the rabbit, or the fox might eat this mouse, or the fox might eat this bird. So there's all these different food chains put together in a little more realistic picture of what might happen in a food web, where we have options essentially of what might eat what. Ecological pyramids kind of continue on with this, where we have this model used to show the relative amount of energy available at each trophic level of a food chain or a food web. So trophic levels, or trophic levels, we'll look at this food chain, it's a little easier to see, are from each of these different stages here. So the first trophic level would be this producer. So the sun gives energy to this producer. We have our first trophic level. The next would be when this primary consumer eats the producer. This is our second trophic level. Secondary consumer is going to be our next trophic level. Tertiary consumers, we combine both of these together to be our next trophic level, which is obviously after the last one with the secondary consumers. So between each of these trophic levels, there's an amount of energy that gets transferred. It's not 100% transfer of energy from sun to that tertiary consumer. There's some loss with each step. So we'll look at this again real quick. Primary producers, like the plants, always make up the first trophic level, and various consumers occupy each other level beyond that. So there's this thing we call the 10% rule. This 10% rule is telling us that with each change in trophic level that we keep only 10% of the available energy. So this is on average. We can't say this is one perfect, but on average, this is about 10% of energy is available to go on to the next trophic level. So if we start with our producers down at the bottom of our pyramid, our producers have 100% of our available energy. After our producers, we have our primary consumers, the first stage of consumers. Only 10% of the energy from our producers are available for our primary consumers. So it's a significant loss. We go from 100% to 10%. Beyond that, we lose another 10% for whatever is going to eat the grubs. So we go on to our secondary consumers. We lose another 10%, so now we're only at 1% of the original energy available. And then as we move further up to the top of our pyramid, or you can think of it going further up to the higher levels of the food chain, there becomes less and less available energy. At the top of this one, we're at 0.1% of the original available energy, which is significantly smaller. But it kind of makes sense. If you think about it, we see lots and lots and lots of plants all over the place because those are primary producers. There's lots of them because of this 10% rule, because so little energy is available at the top of the food chain. We just have to have a lot of it. So we have a lot of producers so that we can have a sustainable population of higher order animals like jaguars and sharks and things like that. That also explains why there are fewer of them, why they're not as common as, say, an oak tree. So we can kind of see this here. Once more, we have the producers, the grass. There's only going to be 10%. We go from 1,000 to 100 kilocalories. To the grasshoppers, we move on to these, whatever those are, some sort of mice or whatever you want to assume they are. We lose another 10% between these two stages, from 100 to 10 kilocalories, and then finally to our owls, to only 1 kilocalorie available. So we go from lots, a little bit less, but still a lot, even fewer, to very few of these tertiary consumers from producers. Now, where does this energy go? Why do we only have 10% that transfers? Well, a large part of it is that a significant amount of this energy is just used by each of these stages. So the producers are going to use a lot of energy to do their own life processes, same as the grasshoppers. They're going to use their energy to do their own life processes. What gets transferred is what is essentially reserve after all these life processes are done in each stage. And then in addition to that, there's some lost in heat each time. So after all these blades of grass have grown, they've done all they have to do to be able to live and also to reproduce, which is going to require a lot of energy. What's available to go to the next level is what it has left over. So what you don't eat off of your plate, 10% of that is what's going to be available to go to the next level. So this is kind of where we're going to stop. Hopefully it's covered a decent amount of information. Hopefully you've gotten something out of it. If you have questions, please come and ask me. We'll talk a little bit about this stuff in class again together. But review this video as many times as you need. Get the information from it. You will be responsible for it. So be sure to ask me questions if you have any.